Hi, my name is Robert Giordano, and I'm from UPlay Learning, a national nonprofit facility developer and lender. This is the first of a series of conversations with industry leaders to help school leaders, board members, demystify financing and the construction or development process for public charter schools. We're going to have short conversations in bite-sized pieces to help you understand the path ahead. And so this morning, we're very, very fortunate to be joined by Tiny McLaughlin, the Director of K-12 Facility Financing for EcoFin. And I'm going to ask Tiny some questions about different financing options that are available out for charter schools around the country. And Tiny, thank you very much for joining us today.
Thanks, Robert. Happy to do it. So basically, if you look at it, there are, 7 or 8 types of ways. No matter what, if you're in a building, you're financing in some way or another. You may not realize it. The first and best way to finance it is to get it as a gift from someone, a big donor.
Who doesn't love a gift?
The second is to co-locate with an existing school. A lot of districts do that. It's a great way to do it. Usually easy. Some potential downsides, and there are only so many places to do it. The third is if the district is friendly to charters and they have excess inventory of buildings, or if the state insists upon it and they provide excess building, that's like that's for you.
Yeah.
The third is to lease a private building, which is typically the most common thing. And in addition, a lease is a financing form. And in addition to that, usually a building, typically a commercial building, is not perfectly set up to be a school, right? As you know.
Right.
And there's some amount of improvements that need to be made. You know, sometimes hundreds of thousands or even millions of dollars.
Right.
And that needs to be financed. And the typical way to do that is through the landlord doing it, and it just gets charged back to you via your...
It's all rolled into the lease.
Yeah. The next one is CDFI financing, Community Development Financial Institution. A lot of great ones out there. And they'll create some type of loan structure, typically with money that's either come from the government or donors, and they'll put it to work.
Government-backed, right?
Government-backed, or sometimes it's government or government, they're actually on a funding line from the government, and they get grants for a certain amount of it, and they'll return it in that form. And that's structured, typically for ownership. They have a mortgage with you and they own it, and it's a great way to do it. One of the downsides is that there's typically the money is limited. They only get so much a year, and oftentimes they have a limit to how much they can lend. And then on top of that, they can only lend 95, 90, 80, 85.
You got to be compliant with
30% of the money or whatever. And particularly in the early stages, charter schools simply will not have that cash. The next one is bank financing, what most people are familiar with. But that tends to only be available to very well-established charter schools, or often in well-established facilities. Because again, the bank is going to view this as a real estate loan, much like the way your home is.
That's how they're viewing it, as a real estate. You also have to come up with 15, 20% down as well.
Or maybe more. And the other thing is banks have a very hard time getting their hands around a business that fundamental businesses, you can get in a 5-year contract right from the state, or a 10-year or whatever it is. And yet you want a loan that may last for 30 years. That doesn't make sense to them. And there are a handful of banks around the country that get it, but by and large, most banks don't.
Okay, fair enough.
If you happen to be in a rural area, one of the best forms of financing out there is the U.S. Department of Agriculture Rural Loan Development System.
It's great money.
Great money.
Great money.
3-4% for up to 40 years. That
takes time.
If you qualify for it, it's great. But sometimes it takes years, even after essentially a local person approves you. It is like anything working with the government.
You have to plan ahead a lot. You had to have a plan.
Yep. And then finally, the most common method out there is some form of, there's developer financing. Let's talk about developer financing. A developer will go at risk. This is the typical for-profit model. They will essentially finance the building of a facility, lease the building to you with an option to purchase it, and they'll usually get, the fee to develop the building, and then there's usually some additional, we're going to sell you the building for 125% of what the value of cost.
You're essentially you're leasing it until you purchase it.
Yes.
And then when you purchase it, the money that you put into it doesn't count, right? You essentially...
Yeah, that'll be leased money up until then. You're right. Because it's in fact a form of financing. They're lending you money that often they borrowed too.
Most of the cases, that's right. And then there's the nonprofit side, such as the organization that we represent, which is essentially the same thing, but it's cheaper money because it's mission driven. It's closer to aligned to the city of Buds.
And the source of your money is at a lower cost of capital. It's all of these things are dependent on the source that the organization involved in gets their capital,
gets their money from,
right? And there's two different areas you can get money from. You can essentially get it in some form of taxable loan or equity that companies have that's out there, or there's a way to access the federally tax exempt and sometimes state tax exempt money out there, and that is typically a lower cost of capital because the return on it being tax exempt means that an investor that maybe is getting 8% tax yield, if a 6.5% is equivalent to that investor. Okay.
So that's that municipal law. And now that kind of leads us into capital markets and municipal bonds, which has been incredibly popular up until really the last year and a half, 2 years with the market change.
Well, what I'd say is that the most typical form of financing for ownership in the church school world is tax-exempt bond financing. And the reason for that is that they've come to recognize that a charter school loan is not a real estate. It is a loan against a stream of government cash flows with a little bit of a real estate collateral if something goes wrong.
It's an important point.
Yeah. And
looked at differently.
Very differently. And they can do that because unlike banks, they don't have to fit things into the same box that meets like banking regulatory requirement. And usually this comes from the big names you've heard of that are in your 401k portfolio. It comes from the tax-exempt bond funds for BlackRock, Invesco, Nuveen, maybe State Street, Pioneer, all names we've heard of.
Right.
And they'll buy, and what a bond is it's essentially a loan that's been broken into pieces and sold in $100,000 increments so that it can be split up amongst people. And what's most typical is that you'll get an investment banker, they'll take you to the general bond market, they'll market it, your school has like almost an initial public offering.
Yeah.
And then, a variety of investors will come in and they'll go, oh, this is a $10 million project. I'll take $2 million of it. And someone else will go, I'll take, I'll take $350,000 of it. And they line up a number of investors and go to do it.
And then there's a difference between something that's rated,
yes,
like through S&P or Moody's, and non-rated, most of the charter school market, which means what?
Well, if you're an exceptional credit, usually if you've been around for 5+ years, and in some cases maybe you've already done a bond and you're refinancing it, it's worthwhile for you to go to one of the major rating agencies out there. Typically for charter schools, it's Moody's or it's Moody's or the Standard & Poor's, S&P. And they'll essentially go in, review things, put their stamp on you and say, the risk of default here is, we've all heard of it, it's AAA, which is the lowest possible risk out there. In charter schools on their own, the predominance of them would get a double B type rating, which in most municipal finance is considered incredibly risky. Charter schools, it's very typical because they aren't the source of their own money. There's some government that gets the money and then passes it on to them. So they take the risk of that government, plus the risk of them being able to fill that school, operate it effectively, provide a high quality education so they continue to bring kids in, and they can get their contract renewed to continue.
So next time we talk, we're going to have a detailed discussion about the risks associated with, from the finance perspective, the risk associated with charter schools, is different types of risks, and most importantly, how do you plan ahead and mitigate those risks so you become a better credit and get cheaper sources of capital.
And I'm going to add one little twist to the bond market out there. And then just so you know, the bond market is, when I say it's the largest form of financing, far and away, while we're in a very different year, interest rates and money available, over the past 3 years, or the 3 years prior, 2020, there was about $4 billion for the charter school bonds. Wow. Okay. 2001, there were $5.5 billion worth of charter school bonds on all for facilities. Last year, there were about $5 billion. This year's a very unusual.
They could go down.
Oh, no. Right now, at this point in the year, there's only been about $1.8 billion done. And so it will be almost every year it's gone up in the past. And the amount of financing. This year, it will not. It will be a significant decline for the first time 10 years.
So what does this mean? We've seen schools go to get to capital markets and get their deals done for 2.5%.
Well, in the public
2.5%.
In the public finance market, you typically see, depending on, it's all driven back to what all money eventually originates at the government with the Fed. And so it depends on what the market rates are. It's a combination of what the market rate is in there. And then on top of that market rate, there is some, what they call spread, that covers your additional risk that's out there. And, I know we want to keep this short and sweet, but I'm going to add one more, just a subset.
Because you're our person asking the series, you have a lot of leeway.
Well, there's one subset of financing in there, and that is the thing with the public bond market is the big bond funds, they can only accept so much risk. So they tend to look at the more established charter schools, tend to need to have a 3-year track record, have 2 or 3 years of audited financials. And we all know that when a charter school has the highest need for a facility is when they're starting up. So there's a group of investors out there, specialty funds, that will do tax-exempt bonds lending, that they'll buy 100% of it because they have an expertise in looking at these early stages,
such as EcoFin.
So again, I don't work with the established charter school groups, typically because they can access the bond market. Schools that have a relatively low risk, and so they can, the rates they can get are lower. I will never be the lowest cost of money out there, but I'm probably the lowest cost that your school can, don't mistake it. If people are getting 5% out there, it's because they're an established school. And when someone goes, well, you're going to get 6.5%, 7%, first year 8%, it's like, well, nobody else is going to lend to you because you don't have the credit worthiness. And so my purpose and the way we do things, we're specifically designed to take schools from that very early stage risky time to get them into some permanent source of financing. So we typically lend, we'll create sometimes into that or a 20-year buck, but we'll say if you like, at 3 years, you can exit it and go to the market. Which bonds tend to, like the public market bonds tend to have a 7 to 10 go out. Yeah. So again, our goal is to get them from this early stage of financing to the time where they're stable and they're going to be able to access long terms.
And this is the perfect time because the market, because the Fed increases the rates, because there's less capital out there available. This is really kind of one of the best times.
Well, this is a really unique position for me because I'm in the position where there's almost no money in the public market.
Right.
So now I'm doing some financing for schools that need to do a facility, but they go to the public market, but they're just not able to access that right now because there's just no money in the market. I happen to have capital right now. And one of the advantages of doing something with EcoFin is that you can go and get money from us for 3 or 5 years, or whatnot. And then you could go back into the market when you believe it's going to be stabilized and cheaper. So again, a lot of different avenues out there. Typically, sort of specialty investors in the bond world usually account for maybe 10% of that 5 billion or 15%. Right now, it's 25 or 30% of that total market, and so very anomalous time. And frankly, if this group of people is providing 25 or 30% of all the capital, it's a broken market.
Yeah.
So
which I think, listen, this is why we're doing this series, because things have changed dramatically in the last 24 months, and they're going to continue to remain this way for the foreseeable future.
Absolutely.
This is a perfect start. You're a perfect guest to start this series. So,
well, thank you for the opportunity to be here. And I know we want to keep these short and hard hitting, so I don't want to rattle on too much, and I just want to thank you. I think what you guys are doing is great. And Robert, we've known each other for well over a decade, and really happy to work with you and to knowing all aspects of this world, from being a school leader to being someone really active in the finance and development world, and somebody I've known who's all the time I've been around helped literally hundreds of schools get their charters, get their start, get their facilities, any number of things. So it's a real pleasure for me to work with someone like you, who's helped so many kids get an opportunity to go to a school that can be really life-changing and that is better or more suited to their needs than that.
Thank you. It's very kind words. And so until next time, when we talk about risk, how to mitigate that risk and how to plan ahead, this is Robert Giordano from New Plan Learning signing off, and we'll see you next time.